The desert sky was laced with gold, the moon and stars my soul enfold. My mind by war is torn apart, sorrow bleeds my aching heart.
In late March 1941, soon after the arrival of the Africa Corps in Tripoli to reinforce the Italians, Axis forces quickly captured the frontline British position at El Agheila and drove a disorganised British army eastwards. By mid-April the front line had stabilised at Sollum in Egypt, but the British managed to hold on to the fortified port of Tobruk. This was of immense strategic importance. Denied the port, Axis supplies had to come ashore at Benghazi, from where they had to be convoyed several hundred miles to the front. Short of troops and with his supply lines heavily stretched, Rommel was unable to continue his advance and in fact had been ordered not to attack. One of the reasons Rommel was denied substantial reinforcements was that the Germans were preparing Operation Barbarossa, the assault on Russia, which Rommel did not know about. By the end of May, the Germans had seized Crete. This gave them more airfields from which to attack Allied shipping and protect their own convoys to Africa, swinging the supply situation in their favour. The British, who were also unaware the Germans planned to invade Russia, feared that time was against them and it would be better to attack now before further reinforcements could reach Rommel. The result was Operation Brevity. Operation Brevity was planned as a limited operation to seize Sollum, Halfaya Pass and Fort Capuzzo, and then, if possible, advance on Sidi Aziz and Tobruk. The objective was to destroy as much Axis equipment as possible and secure a foothold in preparation for a much larger operation, Operation Battleaxe, that would be carried out once reinforcements had arrived. Brevity began on the 15th of May, and both Fort Capuzzo and Halfaya Pass were quickly captured. However, concern about German panzers led to the decision to abandon the operation prematurely and evacuate Capuzzo. The only gain was Halfaya Pass, and that was retaken by a small German force on the 27th of May. Although Brevity had ultimately failed to secure any advantage for the British, Rommel had been alarmed by the ease with which they had been able to pierce his defences, and being both unable and forbidden to attack, he had instead concentrated on fortifying the frontier. Mines and anti-tank guns were dug in on both ends of Halfaya Pass, at Fort Capuzzo, and two strong points, Point 206 to the south and the Hafid Ridge to the west. The general commanding Middle East, Wavell, was convinced, with some justification, that the British Western Desert Force was vastly inferior to the Axis forces now in Africa. Churchill agreed and decided to send reinforcements through the dangerous Mediterranean route rather than the safe but long route around the Cape of Good Hope. This was an extremely fraught decision. Not only might the precious tanks and aircraft be sunk in transit, but they were being moved from Britain at a time when a German invasion was still a distinct possibility. The gamble paid off. Convoy WS-58, codenamed Tiger, got through largely unscathed, only one merchant ship, the Empire Song, being lost to a mine. 238 tanks and 43 Hurricane fighters were delivered to Alexandria. Unloading and prepping the tanks for desert service took longer than expected, so Battleaxe, which had originally been scheduled to start on the 7th of June, was pushed back to the 15th of June. Much depended on the coming battle. It was to be the first really serious British counterattack against Rommel in the desert. Leading the overall ground operation was Lieutenant General Beresford Pierce. He had two divisions available, the 4th Indian Infantry Division under the command of Major General Messervy, and the 7th Armoured Division under the command of Major General O'More Cree. The 4th Indian Infantry Division had only one of its brigades, the 11th Indian Infantry Brigade, and so the independent 22nd Guards Infantry Brigade, which was motorised, was placed under its command. All the infantry formations were composed of experienced battle-tested soldiers, accustomed to the desert, and they were in peak fighting condition. The 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, was in March 1941 a newly formed organisation and not the force it was to become. It had only two armoured brigades, and each only had 2 rather than the prescribed 3 regiments. The 4th Armoured Brigade was equipped with a total of 104 of the infantry Mark II Matildas delivered by the Tiger convoy. The type was well known to the British Army in the desert. The 7th Armoured Brigade was made up of a total of 101 cruiser tanks. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment was an assortment of older A9, A10 and A13s. The 6th Royal Tank Regiment with the new Crusader 1 tanks directly from the Tiger convoy. A brand new design, there had been very little time to acclimatise them to desert conditions or for the crews to familiarise themselves with the type. Both brigades also had a few troops of Vickers Mark VI light tanks, probably the B version. These armed tanks were far too small and light for direct combat, but they were handy for screening and reconnaissance. All told, the British deployed a total of approximately 230 tanks of all types. To increase their range, they were fitted with a rotor trailer which carried extra water, rations, ammunition, lubricants and fuel. There were serious question marks over the quality of the British tanks, which General Wavell was fully aware of and detailed to London. The infantry tanks were too slow for a fight in the desert, where the wide open spaces made mobility far more important. They were well protected against most of the Axis anti-tank guns, but the new 75mm pack guns, and especially the 88mm flat gun, penetrated their thick armour with ease. The cruiser tanks could match the mobility of the German tanks, but they were notoriously mechanically unreliable, and this was particularly true of the Crusader tanks, which were new to the theatre. In any event, the difference in mobility between the two types made it difficult for them to work together. The 7th Armoured Division also fielded a special support group, consisting of 2 motorised infantry regiments and 2 batteries of horse artillery. This was a new development for the British, emulating the mixed battle groups of tanks, artillery and infantry that the Germans had proven were superior to just tank forces on their own. Unfortunately, shortage of troops, particularly motorised troops, led to the 7th Support Group being used in independent formation detailed for flank protection, thus depriving the armoured brigades of direct infantry and artillery support. The Air Officer, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, one Arthur Tedder, was instructed to support the offensive by all means possible, even if it meant stripping support from other theatres. Accordingly, additional squadrons were transferred from East Africa, and from squadrons reforming in Egypt. All told, there were 6 fighter and 8 bomber squadrons, about 200 aircraft in total, split fairly evenly between fighters and bombers. The principal fighter was the Hawker Hurricane, with a single squadron of the new American-built Tomahawk. The main bombers were Wellingtons, Blemins and Martin Marylands. Although the British were fighting an Axis army, most of the forces they would be encountering were German. The Italian infantry divisions had been entrusted with investing in Tobruk, and the Italian armoured division, the Ariete, was held in reserve ready to check any sorties from the fortress. The Germans had 2 divisions, the 5th Light and the newly arrived 15th Panzer. As with the British, both units were considerably under strength. The 5th Light Division's main strength was the 5th Panzer Regiment, with 57 Panzer Mark III and 4 tanks, plus 39 Panzer I and Panzer IIs. The main components of the 15th Panzer Division was the 9th Panzer Regiment, with 62 Panzer IIIs and 4s and 36 Panzer IIs. There were also 4 battalion-sized infantry units, the 33rd Reconnaissance Unit, the 1st Battalion of the 104th Motor Infantry Regiment, the 33rd Panzerjäger Battalion, and the 15th Motorcycle Battalion. There was also an artillery battalion. Also under operational control of the 15th Panzer Division were 3 infantry battalions and an artillery regiment from the Italian Trento Division. On paper, the Axis air forces were rather stronger than the RAF, but as per usual, the Italian contribution was severely weakened by low serviceability rates, and in terms of operational aircraft, the Axis had only slightly more planes than the British did. Their force also had a rather high proportion, 60 to 40, of fighters to bombers. The British commanders were keen to make the maximum use of their air force. Prior to the start of the operation, the RAF was to bomb Benghazi and any Axis movement on the frontier, and during the operation provide maximum air cover. To ensure the smooth operation of these extra resources, Beresford Pearce had his headquarters at Sidi Barrani, from where he could communicate effectively with RAF HQ. Unfortunately, this was a 5-hour drive from the main battle. The original plan for Operation Battleaxe was for the 7th Armoured Brigade to relieve Tobruk, while the 4th Armoured Brigade, with infantry support, secured the frontier. This plan had to be abandoned because the British simply did not have enough transport available to support such a mobile operation. A less ambitious plan was adopted instead that would employ the largest possible force that could be supplied and still do something. The 4th Indian Division, with support from infantry tanks from the 4th Armoured Brigade, was to destroy the Axis forces in the frontier area and secure the strategic Hellfire Pass. The rest of the 7th Armoured Division was to cover the desert flank, occupy key positions and engage German armour, believed to be around Hafid Ridge. After capturing the frontier, the Western Desert Force would reform and continue on north to relieve Tobruk. Once joined by the Tobruk garrison, the combined forces would then press the offensive westwards, driving the Germans as far back as possible. The plan was based on faulty intelligence information, which incorrectly indicated that 2/3 of the German tank strength was situated around Tobruk. While the British were reorganising, the Germans were busy as well. A considerable boost for Rommel's preparations came from his excellent signals intelligence units, which exploited some decidedly poor British signal security and gave the Germans considerable advance notice of the operation, including dispositions, concerns and intentions. With this information, the 5th Light Division was withdrawn from forward positions and placed where it could be used against the Somme area or Tobruk itself. The 15th Panzer Division, together with its Italian elements, was given responsibility for defending the frontier. Rommel also ordered a mass artillery bombardment on Tobruk on the day the operation started in order to forestall a breakout. For the RAF, everything went according to plan on the first day. Fighters swarmed over the battlefield, achieving almost total air superiority. Only 6 minor German air attacks managed to break through in the whole day, and they inflicted little damage. British columns were able to move virtually unmolested from their starting points into attack positions. RAF bombers concentrated on Axis supply convoys moving up to the front, although curiously it was strafing fighters that caused more damage. On the ground, events proceeded less well. To attack Hellfire Pass, 11th Indian Infantry Brigade was divided into 2. 1 infantry battalion, a squadron of Matildas and an artillery battery were to attack the western escarpment. Meanwhile, 2 infantry battalions, 2 troops of Matildas and a few 25-pounders attacked the eastern end. Unfortunately, the British artillery got bogged down in soft sand and was unable to support the attack. German anti-tank guns made short work of the Matildas to the west, and a counterattack by German infantry and armoured cars pushed back the British infantry. On the eastern side, the Matildas ran to a minefield, and a torrent of machine gun fire pinned down the British infantry. By the end of the day, the British had suffered heavy casualties and had achieved nothing. In the centre, the rest of the 4th Armoured Brigade had better luck. Pushing forwards, they easily took Fort Capuzzo, scattering the defenders, who retreated north to join the 15th Panzer Division, which lay between them and Bardia. Soon after, however, they faced several counterattacks by a battalion from the 8th Panzer Regiment. This was not a serious assault, as Rommel was not prepared to commit the 15th Panzer Division to battle yet, and the attack was easily repulsed. Indeed, the 8th Panzer Regiment's primary tactic was to skirmish briefly and then feign a disordered rout in order to lure Matilda tanks into a chase, which led them directly onto concealed anti-tank guns. But the British failed to be drawn, and little damage was suffered by either side. At point 206, resistance was much more substantial, and both sides took heavy casualties in some hard fighting. But at the end, although half their tanks had been disabled, the British were in possession. That night, a battalion of the 22nd Guards Brigade advanced further east and captured an outpost at Musaid. The 7th Armoured Brigade on the desert flank did less well. They were tasked with seizing Hafid Ridge, which actually consisted of 3 separate ridges. The British attacked with the older cruiser tanks of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment in the lead, with the new Crusaders of the 6th Royal Tank Regiment behind, so they could be a surprise to the enemy. But it was the British who were surprised. As the 2nd RTR crossed the first ridge, they were engaged at point-blank range by dug-in anti-tank guns. The British beat a hasty retreat. Contrary to popular opinion, the 2-pounder guns the British tanks were armed with did have a high explosive round, but it was so ineffective that it was rarely issued. The supporting artillery was all in the support group, which was deployed as flank protection and hence not available. With just tanks available, the British decided on a flanking attack. This caught the Germans by surprise, and many anti-tank guns and infantry were overrun, but the British advance was stopped cold by emplaced 88s on point 208. So the outcome of the first day of the battle was decidedly mixed for both sides. The Germans had managed to hold Hafid Ridge and Hellfire Pass, but had suffered many casualties in infantry and guns. The British had captured Fort Capuzzo and had the defenders of Hellfire Pass surrounded, but had lost a considerable number of tanks. The British plan for the second day of Battleaxe was largely to refresh and reorganise. They had little choice but to scale down their operations because of the heavy losses of armoured vehicles. The 4th Indian Division was to continue attacking Hellfire Pass, but also to support the 7th RTR at Fort Capuzzo. The rest of the 4th Armoured Brigade would join the 7th Armoured Brigade and overpower the outnumbered German 5th Light Division, while still protecting the desert flank. The Germans, helped by their excellent signals intelligence, planned significant counterattacks themselves. Aware of the British plans, Rommel ordered 8th Panzer Regiment to make spoiling attacks towards Fort Capuzzo, while the 5th Light Division attacked the 7th Armoured Brigade on the flank. The result was a protracted series of attacks and counterattacks around Fort Capuzzo, but the British gained the upper hand. The Germans attacked Fort Capuzzo in 2 columns, but had to advance over open ground in the teeth of 2-pounder and 25-pounder shot. They lost nearly 40 tanks and 500 prisoners and achieved nothing. Later on, British infantry were able to seize Sollum. The only problem was that the British success had been achieved by 4th Armoured Brigade being drawn into the fight, which left 7th Armoured Brigade on its own. As a result, the Germans did much better against the lighter British cruiser tanks on the flank. The 5th Light Division struck west of Hafid Ridge and pushed south. The 7th Armoured Brigade, joined by the support group, kept pace with them, jabbing at the moving column whenever it could. The result was a running battle that went on until the Germans reached Sidi Omar at nightfall. The British had their successes, but the German Panzer IV tanks used their high explosive rounds to devastate the supporting 25-pounders. With the British being stripped of close artillery support, the Germans could then close on the thinly armoured cruiser tanks and engage them beyond the effective range of their 2-pounder guns. If the British tried to close, the German tanks would retreat, drawing them onto pre-planned anti-tank gun screens. By the end of the day, 7th Armoured Brigade was down to only 21 tanks. At Hellfire Pass, stubborn resistance continued to hold all British attacks. Beresford Pierce's plan was that the 22nd Armoured Brigade would continue to hold the Fort Capuzzo area, while the 4th Armoured Brigade and the 7th Armoured Brigade would unite to fight the German armoured units. On the other side of the hill, Rommel was becoming concerned about the state of the garrison at Hellfire Pass. Although they were holding well, they were cut off and running out of supplies. Accordingly, Rommel decided to push for the Hellfire Pass. The 15th Panzer Division was ordered to leave only minimal forces confronting the British at Fort Capuzzo, and move the bulk of the division westwards and then south to join 5th Light Division. The two would then drive south and then eastwards towards Sidi Suleiman, encircling the British troops at Fort Capuzzo and trapping them all. These movements soon put the British in a difficult position. At Capuzzo, the early morning movements of the 15th Panzer Division, far from relieving the pressure on the 22nd Guards Brigade, led Messervy to believe that another attack was imminent, and he hurriedly cancelled Beresford Pierce's orders for the 4th Armoured Brigade to reinforce the 7th, so that they could instead be available to support his infantry. The result was that 7th Armoured Brigade was badly outmatched. The 5th Light Division hit them at 0600, and by 0800 they had pushed them back to Sidi Suleiman. By mid-morning the Germans were within 10 miles of Hellfire. Messervy realised he was threatened with encirclement, and on his own initiative ordered a withdrawal. The remnants of the 4th Armoured Brigade finally linked up with the 7th Armoured Brigade and the support group, forming a screen to protect the withdrawing infantry from the German armour. There was some sharp fighting, but the British tanks managed to stall the German advance until 1600 hours, by which time 22nd Guards and 11th Indian Division had successfully escaped. The Germans were able to press on and relieve the garrison at Hellfire Pass. Operation Battleaxe was over. Tactically, the result of the 3-day battle was a triumph for Rommel. The forces involved in Operation Battleaxe were not high, and personnel casualties on both sides were fairly light. The British recorded 969 killed, wounded and missing. Axis casualties came to 1,270, although this may have included a great many Italian prisoners the British were forced to release when they retreated. Materially, the results were much more uneven, principally because the Germans, having retained control of the battlefield, were better able to recover and repair their damaged machines. All told, the British suffered the total loss of 65 Matildas, 16 Crusaders, 14 assorted other cruiser tanks and 3 of the light Vickers Mark VI's, a total of 98. The Germans only completely lost 12 tanks, 5 Panzer IIs, 6 Panzer IIIs and a single Panzer IV. The Italian tanks were not engaged. In the air, the RAF lost 36 planes, all but 3 of which were fighters, whereas the Axis air forces lost only 10. The main reason for the high loss of fighters was the heavy use of standing patrols to guarantee air superiority and their increasing use for ground attack. Strategically, Operation Battleaxe ended in a stalemate. The British were unable to secure their objectives, but at the same time the Germans were not able to press on towards Egypt because of their lack of supplies. The most immediate consequences of the battle were political. Churchill was particularly displeased with the results of Operation Battleaxe. He had been expecting nothing less than complete success, and not only had the operation failed, but a great many of the tanks that had been specially sent for it at great risk had been lost. Because simply sacking the commanders of Battleaxe would have been embarrassing, the 2 leading figures were moved sideways. Wavell swapped jobs with the GOC India, Claude Auchinleck, and Beresford Pierce was made GOC of Sudan, being replaced by General Godwin Austen. There were several reasons for the failure of Battleaxe. The haste in which it was mounted must be a major reason. At all levels there were serious communication difficulties between ground and air forces. The 2 services worked very well together to form the initial plan for Battleaxe, but limited provisions were made to sustain this teamwork in combat. RAF reconnaissance aircraft discovered the advancing German columns, but this information was not promptly acted upon. The bomber's striking force, held to attack targets of opportunity, was not called into action until too late in the battle. Primarily, though, the British defeat was down to inferior equipment and tactics. The tanks were either too slow or too fragile, and their armament was becoming obsolete. The recovery services were nowhere near efficient enough, leading to many unnecessary losses. Most importantly of all, at this stage of the war, British tanks tended to operate independently and deliberately sought out combat with their German opposite numbers, and this placed them at a severe disadvantage when up against combined arms of tanks, infantry and artillery, which covered each other's weaknesses. The other factor contributing to the defeat of the British was Rommel's excellent leadership. His preparations were comprehensive and extensive, and he judged the timing for his counterstroke perfectly. To defeat him, the British would need more and better equipment, better tactics, and a commander capable of inspiring and leading them with the same panache as the Desert Fox.
The sands of time, the sands of time, the ever-shifting